Good morning, everyone. My name is Esther Silver. I am the IT Security Training and Awareness Program Manager here at UCSF. And I thank you for joining today's Cybersecurity and Accessibility webinar. It's part of the UC System-Wide Cyber Champion Cybersecurity Awareness Month celebration. I will be putting up the URL soon so you can check out and see if there's other events you'd also like to attend. Before we start, I want to mention two people who are instrumental in making this webinar happen. My partner in the project, Andrea McCall. She is the Security Information Analyst within UCLA UHIT Information Security Compliance Department. And Jill Walters, the Web Standards Program Manager for UCSF IT Web Services. She really got us connected to the people we needed to talk to. And we are thrilled to have Cecile Puretz join us today as the moderator for a panel discussion. She serves as Assistant Director of Disability Access and Inclusion at UCSF, which is an inaugural role for both UCSF and the entire UC system. She is a member of the Office of Diversity and Outreach and focuses on ensuring that UCSF is an inclusive place for people with disabilities to work, learn, and receive healthcare. She provides consultation around developing accessible events and serves as a liaison to students with disabilities. Today, she will be joining us to moderate our panel. Welcome, Cecile, and all our panelists and attendees. I believe this is the first webinar of its kind to be offered at UCSF, and we are thrilled to be joined by content experts who are here to share their insights and expertise into making cybersecurity more accessible for people with disabilities. Before I pass the mic over to Cecile, I would like to review a couple of housekeeping items. You can enable the live transcript of this Zoom session by clicking on CC button on your menu bar. We will have Q&A following the presentation. Please use the Q&A function to ask any questions. We will be sharing a survey after today's webinar. We encourage you to fill it out so we can bring you even better events in the future. And then with that, and you do see the URL up there in case you want to check out the other events. With that, I would like to hand it over to Cecile. So thank you, Cecile.
Thank you so much, Esther, for that introduction, and good morning, everyone. Thank you again for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Cecile Puretz. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve as the Assistant Director of Disability Access and Inclusion here at UCSF. So over these last 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen our reliance on digital technologies has significantly increased, and access to the internet has become really a fundamental element of our lives. From our healthcare system to education and employment, it provides us with access to opportunities, but also to critical services. However, not everyone has access to these same resources and services equitably. The reality is that for many people with disabilities, security measures are often, and digital technologies are often largely inaccessible. So we're joined today by a panel of disability community leaders and experts who are working to close the digital divide so that all people with disabilities have equitable, accessible, and safe internet access. Our panelists will also share strategies with us today that we can all consider when we're planning, developing, implementing, and even purchasing new technologies at UCSF and beyond. So welcome, panelists. I'd like to invite you to turn on your cameras. Thank you so much for joining us today. So I'm going to start off sharing a little bit about the structure. So we're going to be asking our panelists to briefly introduce themselves. Then I'll be asking some questions that draw out some of the key themes to our conversation today. And then following that, we'll have a Q&A, opening up the floor to you, our audience members, to ask questions. So let's get started. So I'd like to start off by welcoming Lucy Greco, who's Web Accessibility Evangelist for UC Berkeley. Welcome, Lucy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Thanks, Lucy. Can you start off by telling us a little bit more about your role at UC Berkeley?
Definitely. So my role as an evangelist is teaching people and literally converting people to the idea of creating accessible, born accessible products, websites, purchasing tools that are accessible, etc. I also lead the UC Electronic Accessibility Committee, and I am the author of the UC accessibility policy as well. So I do a lot of evangelism work across the entire UC system.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that introduction. And moving on to our next slide, Lucy, can you tell us a little bit? So security and accessibility affect real people. How are the effects to users with disabilities different? And how are they the same when digital content is inaccessible and insecure?
So people with disabilities are often stymied by some of the accessibility measures. And let me give something that's a very recent example that was literally, hardened to us during the pandemic itself. When we had to find ways to do secure proctored exams, for example, a lot of the tools that we were using for that proctoring were inaccessible, and they were fundamentally inaccessible because of the design. So for example, proctoring software requires that a person show their photo ID. Well, a blind person can't tell how to hold up the photo ID to show it. So for example, when I did some testing, because I am blind myself, I was not able to tell which side had the photo on it to show to the camera. And therefore, I was blocked out of the particular proctoring session. The similarities are that these are challenges that we face in the IT community on a daily basis, in that people look to buy software or create websites that are not aware of what the things that they have to check and do are. So like a person may not necessarily know how to create an accessible form for someone, they may not actually be aware of how to actually secure that form from being spammed and being overloaded by, malicious attacks. Where somebody might want to use something like a CAPTCHA, which is the challenge that asks you to identify the items in the picture, that necessarily is something that requires sight to do. Did they choose an accessible version of that? Did they actually choose a tool or a way of actually securing that form that works and is effective for everyone? The biggest similarity between security and accessibility is that very few people actually understand the principles, but we always work together. I recently started working with our security department, and what we have found is that the departments that end up having security problems also end up having accessibility problems. You need care, caution, and you need to understand the realm of both accessibility, security, and why not privacy, to actually do an excellent job of making sure that everyone can use your tool, but also use your tool safely and securely.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for sharing also just those concrete strategies of what folks can do to really ensure that the measures that they're taking are fully accessible. And we're going to come back to talking about CAPTCHA in a moment. So moving on to our next panelists, welcome Dianes Chen. Thank you so much for joining us. So Dianes is the Online Accessibility Program Manager at Stanford University. Dianes, can you please introduce yourself and your role?
Sure. I have been the program manager at Stanford for 7 years. Actually, I just left Stanford last month. But during my time there, I was doing education outreach and also trying to elevate the program. And I did manage to get it from a one-person shop for the entire university to now we have about 5 people at the office. So and part of what I do is also working with a lot of our IT colleagues, such as my very first meeting was with our CISO. and just trying to learn from him of how he had rolled out these security programs. So I'm so glad that we have a combined session about these efforts.
And how great to hear that it's also grown, that office has grown through partnerships.
Yes. Yeah, we get more formalized. Yeah.
Excellent. So moving on to sort of more targeted question is, how can security and accessibility really collaborate and work together?
So I'm going to start off with a little bit more information about why we should do it. So when we don't do it right, as Lucy said, people get impacted, and there is knowing a little bit about what the other people are doing really helps. How the process work. So, for example, there is something in the accessibility world called accommodation. That means if the data or the information is not accessible, someone in the system has to get the data to the person who needs it. And this someone might not be using a secure electronic format. They can pick whatever they want. And so accessibility, making something accessible could be, accommodating someone could be the weakest link in securing your system and network. So for security and accessibility to collaborate together, watch out for each other. So for example, I know that security means, checking it, authenticating users before they get into the system. But what happens after getting the system? That's mainly how accessibility gets in. Accessibility is more of a front end, and they also get into the academic parts of the system. And so, for example, during the pandemic, we just heard that Zoom now has automated captioning, auto-generated captioning. I was curious. I went and looked at it, and I realized that tiny at the bottom of the screen, it says it's powered by Auto AI. And that kind of raised a red flag, because we're using Zoom for a lot of meetings. And it sounded like Auto is taking our conversation, pulling it onto the server of data, pulling on the server, doing something with it, and then feeding it back. So I alerted the security office to take a look at the contract. So knowing a little bit about what the other person is doing is really helpful, is just to collaborate and let the other team know. So my heuristic for both teams is, if you see anything that's front end related and it impacts a lot of people, send it to the accessibility team, have them check it out. And for the accessibility folks, if you see anything data related that impacts a lot of people, anything private, send it to the security people. And that's how we might be able to work together. My second tip is, I wish we can sync up on our validation process. We kind of we each have different standards, and trying to validate what the vendor product does or can do is very disorganized and disjointed, and it takes more time for each team to check and to alert each other, and there are lots of gaps where one of us could slip through. So in the process as well.
Thank you so much, Chen, for sharing those core tips that are really drawn from your expertise at Stanford. I'm sure we can all learn from those. Thank you. So moving on to our next panelist, welcome Ting Sue. Ting is a teacher of students with visual impairments here in San Francisco at San Francisco State University. Welcome, Ting. So glad to have you join us.
Thank you for having me.
Ting, can you tell us a little bit more about your work at San Francisco State?
Yeah, sure. So by trade, I'm a teacher of blind and low vision students. We use the acronym TVI. So that means I'm actually an educator in the K-12 system by trade. So working as an itinerant teacher of the visually impaired, TVI, with blind and low vision students in the school district. At San Francisco State, I've had the pleasure of coordinating the graduate teaching program in visual impairments. So I also, my day job, I guess, is my teacher prep hat, where I train teachers of the visually impaired.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. And now to sort of dive in a little bit more to your area of expertise. So we know that research has shown that there's still a lot of persistent barriers for people who are blind or low vision to join STEM fields due to inaccessibility of digital technologies. So my question has sort of two parts. How do accessibility and privacy considerations impact students in the education system?
Okay, so pretty loaded question here. So while my full-time job is really teacher training and teacher prep, a lot of my consultation work is on issues of multimedia accessibility, and specifically digital multimedia accessibility. This is really relevant in accessibility and privacy considerations because when students don't have access to the information that impacts them, they no longer are part of the conversation and they become disempowered in even being able to consider decisions and systemic systems that impact their privacy. So, you know, when these when these systems of information technology and security are inaccessible to our students, they end up losing that ability to even be self-determined in their behavior on how to make the decisions, to be in control, to even give consent. So many of our students, even when receiving services, consent is not even part of that process. And consent is the foundation of privacy decisions, I think.
Thank you so much. And you know, sort of to tease out a little bit deeper in that question is sort of how do security considerations differ for blind and low vision individuals when it comes to information accessibility?
Sure. You know, I think too often the conversation jumps right to the accessibility of technologies in general, but it's actually a deeper issue of information accessibility. So as mentioned, like if you can't even access the information to make good decisions, you are unable to give consent. So with these security considerations, it's really a problem of information inaccessibility. Information that's available to everybody in the community is often unperceivable to our students. And when it's unperceivable, it is then rendered inaccessible. So I think this is a data accessibility issue where we have to make sure that all the data that people need to even weigh whether or not something is secure has to be accessible. You know, and it's really an issue of perceiving, because when we think about perception of information, it automatically puts it in a framework of the different ways people can interact with information, and not just access it, but develop it for themselves. And that's why we need more blind and low vision people in this conversation as builders and designers, as well as just people who can access the information.
Thank you. I think that last point that you really sort of touched on is the importance of really centering the lived experience and expertise of people who are blind and low vision in developing these digital technologies. So thank you really for sharing that, Ting.
Thank you.
So now we're going to move on to our next panelist. Welcome, Diane Tayo.
Thank you.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Thank you for joining us. So Diane has held many roles at UCLA. It is an employee in the UCLA Health and has held multiple titles of security manager of risk assessment, security manager of vulnerability remediation, amongst many other roles. Welcome, Diane. Can you share a little bit more about your current role?
Certainly. I am very proud to say that I am part of the program to bring disaster recovery per application to UCLA and make sure that they're tested. So in case if there ever is an emergency or an outage, that the applications can come back up and without affecting business or patient care.
Thank you. And especially, I think, in this time of increased climate disasters and COVID-19, access to secure, accessible information is all the more vital. So thank you.
Correct.
So diving in a little bit more, Diane, can you tell us a little bit more about why is it important to consider accessibility along with security?
Yes, and as you may already know, not only is it Cybersecurity Month, but it's also National Disability Month. So it's important to always consider accessibility when writing anything that any of our patients, clients, or employees may be using. I'm going to give the definition of accessibility. It means that all people can receive, understand, navigate, and integrate with electronic information and to be active, contributing members to the digital world. Visual, audio, physical, speech connectivity, and neurology disability should be all taken into account. Not to mention, it is the law. The one thing that I wanted to bring up today is not so much on the security side, but more on the disability side. People think of, I hate to say it, but lack of a better word, the more common disabilities such as death, blindness, physical impairment. The thing that we have to think about is a little bit deeper because we've got people that have dyslexia and other learning disabilities where just typing in a password or doing, like you said, the CAPTCHA could be very difficult, if at all possible, for someone with those. Also, someone that has attention deficit disorder, any psychiatric disabilities or brain trauma disabilities. So researching this, I've come that I was very surprised on how many that I did not think of off the top of my head. And in a past life while writing programs, did not think of those. So not only do you need to think about the visually, the deaf, all of those, you want to take into consideration more of the day-to-day, because all of those are included in our student population, our patient population, as well as our employee population. So we just want to make sure that we take all disabilities into effect, no matter how slight or how horrible it may be, so that people can get the information that they need to do their jobs or to be able to contact a physician when needed.
Thank you so much, Diane, for really sort of sharing and imparting sort of the importance of nuance and diversity in terms of disability. So thank you.
You're very welcome.
Excellent. So moving on to our next panelist. Next, I'd like to invite Nicholas Borton. Welcome, Nicholas.
Thank you.
And Nicholas works at UC Davis as the Chief Information Security Officer, who brings extensive experience in IT and cybersecurity. Nicholas, can you tell us a little bit about your role and the mission of your work?
Sure. So just quick correction there, the UC Davis health system, I don't want to take Cheryl's job and title away from her. She does a tremendous job over there on the campus. I come from a different background, so I do have some unique visual characteristics, and I take a lot of accessibility and usability to heart for things that I've had to go through growing up in IT. I also come from my former company where, I did penetration testing and assessments of websites, and the other arm of our company did the web accessibility assessment. So we were able to compare notes and kind of put plans together to ensure that some of the public California websites were usable. Coming here, being the Chief Information Security Officer, I have to take sort of that background, that personal, bias for wanting things to be accessible, balance it against some of the security risks. One I'll talk about is brute force attempts, and then sometimes even make choices to approve software that even though we go through a very comprehensive evaluation in IT and accessibility is one of our requirements, there's oftentimes that third parties or services that we need to utilize to empower the business just aren't there. So I can hit it from all different prongs. We talked CAPTCHA earlier, that was mentioned. So CAPTCHA is, and I always get the acronym wrong, completely automated public Turing test to tell computers and humans apart. I think I got that right. And so in the early days, it was, it was really simple. It was, hey, here's some text. In some forms, Google used it for unreadable text in books so that the human was actually the person that was transcribing it appropriately. And then they would compare that against, 10 different people, 100 different people, 1,000, who knows how many people. And if the transcriptions matched, then that was, the correct interpretation of old text. It morphed, it got to complexities where it kind of became a joke of, I'm not a robot and you'd have to click that. Doing math puzzles, telling which, house has snow on the roof, all these different issues that are very difficult for someone. Probably the worst is the letters, and they kind of wiggle and they have different, like a noise in the background of them. I never can get those correct. If I click on the audio, I still can't get those correct because I don't think as much testing and tuning goes into sort of that audio presentation, right? Like it's all designed for the visual person. But that helps us. So from a security front, we don't want someone being able to come into the front door and say, hey, give me record 1, and give me record 2 and automate that. We don't want someone being able to paste, a username and a password and go from A to Z to AAZZ and go through the alphabet quickly. So we want to slow them down. And that's where CAPTCHAs come in. Traditionally, they were, if you tried maybe once or twice or 3 times, there was a test, and then the CAPTCHA would come in to slow you down. So you were given a few chances. They've sort of progressed to be everywhere. And now there's actually, I think, better technologies coming out. Cloudflare recently brought Turnstile, so it's free. Turnstile is trying to leverage things like browser disparities. So we all have different plugins, different fonts, different settings on our computer. So it's trying to leverage, these JavaScript quick asks. Does your mouse, does it go from, a straight line to click yes? Does it wiggle? All these different telemetry data that they're bringing in and behaviors. How that affects us is when we make design decisions. So one, we can bring in backend logic to, the application tier. So instead of putting it on the user, the website itself can be coded to look for these things outside of CAPTCHA. The website itself or the database can do silent lockouts, different issues there. And then we can move it forward to, really not having traditional CAPTCHAs to some of these newer technologies, but that takes regression testing, that takes going back through SDLC for a lot of these websites and services that we support, and we need to put a priority on those. I think we're fortunate to work for the UC system, who really takes it seriously. Some of the web content accessibility guidelines are built into the SDLC. But we do struggle a little bit for our employees, on the inside, because we do have to buy those third parties. And it's just not as broad of coverage for the traditional disabilities. And I think that's an amazing point too on ones we don't think about, picking up your phone, and we're doing mobile design now. And can you, Apple has like that dual pressure, right? So can you press lightly, or can you double tap, or can you actually use your 3 fingers to triple tap on the screen so that you can get the zoom to come in? Right. So it all kind of goes hand in hand, and then it, becomes that risk decision on what's the end functionality, who's our target audience, that, we need to create these alternatives for, and then potentially just building those secondary sites like we used to do, bilingual sites. And now we have text only sites. The dyslexia comment is amazing because we have fonts that, we can just push on our website, probably pretty simple through a cascading style sheet to have fonts that are specifically designed to try to help in that arena.
Yeah, thank you so much for that overview, Nicholas. And I'm wondering, you're talking about sort of procurement processes, sort of, can you share any sort of specific strategies that you've used or that you've successfully used sort of within your role at UC Davis to ensure that when new technologies are being purchased, that they are being sort of systematically sort of tested and vetted for accessibility? What are some strategies that you can share for folks here with us today who want to ensure that our procurement processes are keeping in mind or keeping accessibility at front of mind?
So here at the health system, we do have a comprehensive IT evaluation. Our accessibility unit is one of the important sign-offs on that to go through for all new technologies that are going to be impactful to the organization, look at it, read their compliance test, and then come back with sort of a, high, medium, low, or yes or no, or whatever that metric is, so that information is used in the decision-making.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I know you touched on, this is sort of the
I was
question.
supposed to
So
wait for
thank
my
you so
slide.
much. You got it. Is there anything else that you wanted to add? And
No, not at this time.
okay, excellent. Thank you. So now we're actually going to be shifting gears a little bit. One of our panelists, Dr. Scott Hollier, was unable to join us due to sort of the time zone. Dr. Scott Hollier is based in Australia. So this is our final panelist, and I'll be playing a short video that is Captions. So Dr. Hollier specializes in the field of digital accessibility and is the CEO and co-founder of the Centre for Accessibility Australia, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to alleviating hardship due to digital access issues. And the question that we asked Dr. Hollier is, where have you seen security and accessibility working together to make solutions better for everyone? So just a moment and I'll play our video.
Hi everyone, I'm Scott Hollier from the Centre for Accessibility Australia. Apologies for not being live. It is a little late in the evening or perhaps early in the morning here, so thank you for the chance to provide this recorded. When it comes to security and accessibility, some of the more traditional ways we've tried to solve that problem of security haven't worked very well for people with disabilities, and CAPTCHA is a great example of that. When we have a look at the traditional CAPTCHA with bitmapped graphics and trying to decipher that text, for people with vision disabilities, that's virtually impossible. Likewise, when we have a look at audio-based CAPTCHA, we often find that it's easier for our digital assistants these days to understand those than it is for us to listen to them. So again, clearly putting people with disability in the bot category. And traditional CAPTCHAs, those visual ones, are also really easy to crack with OCR these days. So a lot of the traditional ways that we've tried to check if someone's a bot or not just really don't work very well for security, let alone for people with disability. And many other solutions just haven't worked that well. There are some parts of CAPTCHA which can work well, like honeypots, for example, are a great option and don't need to bother the user at all. Some of the reCAPTCHA solutions with Google, like I am not a bot tick box or reCAPTCHA v3, which doesn't bother the user at all, are also very accessible, but if it does suspect you are a bot, it then falls back to a more inaccessible CAPTCHA, so not a complete solution. So therefore, things like federated identity, verifiable credentials are all mechanisms that we have a look at. The main challenge though is that as an individual, if we take say two-step authentication or text messages or email, we do still tend to find out who the person is when doing that security check. So while it might be accessible, say using one device to verify another device, we do tend to know who the person is that's doing that. So it doesn't have that anonymity. That said, I personally feel that having companies know who I am, if it preserves my security, is not such necessarily a bad thing, because it might have some accessibility benefits. For example, let's say that I'm legally blind, and let's say I want to use some accessibility features like high contrast, a screen reader, a screen magnifier. And it would be great if my needs and preferences were synchronized across whatever ecosystem I'm using. If I'm using an Apple device, I'd still want high contrast, I'd still want my screen reader and magnifier. If I'm using Google Android, I'd still want that too. Likewise, Windows or Mac. So if part of that security verification could also bring my accessibility features along, so it does know something about me, but then carries all my accessibility preferences, that would be a great benefit to myself as a person with a disability. So I think one of the benefits we can look at going forward, and I hope some food for thought for the panel, is that, can we combine some of the great benefits of security along with the great benefits of accessibility? And given that most CAPTCHA forms tend to put people with disability in the bot category, I think the time has come where we can look at wider solutions for everyone and take accessibility on the journey as well. Thanks very much, everyone. And if you would like to touch base, the website for my organisation is accessibility.org.au, and our contact details are there if you want to get in touch. Thanks so much, everyone.
All right. Well, thank you so much. So actually, before we move into our Q&A period, we have another couple minutes, but I wanted to sort of open it back up to our panelists to sort of end on this note of sort of what are some of these wider solutions that we can all be focusing on. You know, Diane, you also mentioned the importance of centering people with disabilities and their expertise. So just wanted to sort of open it up to our panelists. What are some solutions? What are some things that we should be focusing on for the future?
So I really want to focus in on what some of the people said and kind of reiterate. And I want to argue with one of the points as well, in that I completely agree with Ting, which is not a surprise because we've agreed in the past, that we need to give people the information about what data is being shared and what data is not being shared, you know, to people with disabilities. They need to understand what the consequences are. Like Scott said in his talk, by getting someone to text you security codes, you're providing them access to who you are and how to contact you, and just opening that vulnerability in that hole a little bit. But unlike Scott, I do not believe that the settings should follow you along, because far too often that information of your settings gets used to identify that you are a person with a disability. And it's none of your business that I am a person with a disability. Stay out of my medical information, which disability is medically related information. You have no right to know that I'm blind. You have no right to know that I might be hearing impaired, what have you. That is my personal private information. And if somehow that data gets on your servers that I am using a screen reader, that helps you identify that I have a disability and you know something about me that you have no right to know.
And I think that's a great
for
reason
sharing
not to
that
use
point. And
Google
just
version 3.
just a quick access note, I'm going to end our slideshow so we could actually be in a group together. Just a moment. Excellent.
I was trying to say there, and that's a great reason not to leverage Google's version 3, right? Because they're the aggregator of all of our data. So when we do look at privacy and cybersecurity and accessibility different, a free or a solution like Cloudflare that has privacy built in is optimal.
Yeah, Nicholas, how do you feel about Honeypot? I mean, that's been traditionally my favorite thing to recommend for security.
I don't know. I mean, I don't really have a clear answer on that one, I guess, to be honest. I mean, I'm not educated enough to have a strong opinion. I can tell you leveraging like VPNs and leveraging other privacy things that do categorize you as a bot, you know, to Dr. Hollier's comment there are challenging as well, because we do want to layer the technologies, but they don't work together. They're all independent streams.
And I believe that would be something that we could look at. And how do we combine all these different bot detectors together? Because Lucy, you mentioned that you like honeypots. My web developer had told me that there was a site that keeps getting hit, that the hacker actually bypassed his honeypot. So they coded their solution into their attack. So maybe, you know, we just have a combination of a lot of these gates might help.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nicholas, Chen, and Lucy for elaborating a little bit more on those considerations. So we do have some questions. Before actually, was there anybody else that wanted to, of our panelists that wanted to contribute to that question answer? Great.
Just,
So we
I do have a question. I want to follow up on that. So Lucy, when you speak
Sure.
honeypot, are you speaking of the technology to put the fake captcha up and see if the bot responds?
Fake
Or,
captcha or form field that is not visible
Yeah.
to the user, etc. Things that the computer will see, but the user will not, etc.
Gotcha. So yeah, I was thinking it was a third party when you asked that.
Yeah.
So when we did security assessments and manual testing, I think as long as it's a person that really wants to get your data, it's not going to offer much. They're going to identify that during the testing process. It probably helps for large scale bots that are just crawling the webs and looking for information. But if it's a APT or if it's a targeted attacker, you're not going to realize the benefit of protection there.
And isn't that the case with most security things, though?
Mm-hmm. It
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. I have a question for Ting. Ting, can you talk a little bit more on why you think, and I agree with you, but I want you to express it more, that the conversation about privacy and security goes away when you have a student with a disability, for example. You know, how the conversation and how people are, what people's data is revealed when you're having the conversations on accessibility.
Sorry, Lucy, can you rephrase that a little bit?
So what data is revealed usually because people forget that accessibility needs to go hand in hand with accessibility? How are people exposed when the accessibility conversation is happening?
Got it. And this actually kind of goes along with the last Q&A question. So I'll just read that question from the chat. So there's a question that came in. Do you have any recommendations for honoring privacy while still getting information needed from someone if they encounter a bug that's related to a disability or tools they use for accessibility? And so I think too often people want a diagnosis or medical condition, or they want to know your disability category. And I think, you know, even as a teacher, when I'm trying to evaluate a student for eligibility for services, I think it's less about the diagnosis, it's less about the disability, but it's about identifying how people want to engage with information. And I think that's the question that is a more practical question to get practical information. Like, how do you want to access this website? How do you want to get information about yourself? How do you want to get information to be able to provide consent? So is it that you would like things in a larger text format? Is it that you want an auditory mode of access? Is it that you need things to be displayed in a tactile format? Is it that you need information sonified? You know, how is it that you would like data to be represented so that you can play with it and make decisions based on it? And I think that can be a way to gauge a person's information needs without bringing that like disability disclosure part into the conversation.
Exactly what I was looking for. The part to remember on that is that far too often when a ticket comes into a system, the person becomes revealed. So for example, far too often I've had somebody reach out to me and say, Mary Jane is having problems reading X because she's blind. That's so inappropriate, and it's so, you know, insecure. You know, I had no right to know that Mary Jane was blind. I just needed to know she needed information in an audio format.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we can involve the person needing access to the, you know, the consumer or whatever, the client. It's got to be a co-constructed process where you can co-create what that information-rich environment looks like for that or feels like for that person. And it's kind of an iterative process of how you get there, but that goal should ultimately be co-created, I think.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for jumping in and asking that question. And Ting, thank you so much. So Andrea, do we have any more questions in the chat box that we would like to open up, share?
We do have a pair of conversations that are somewhat related about policies, standards. How do we get accessibility into the UC system? Particularly, there need to be resources for accessibility testing. How do you get leadership to provide those resources if there's not already a team to UC? And kind of tying into that, what are the UC level policy standards and best practices that can help point to leadership, hey, you need to be doing this anyway?
So having written the policy, I'm probably the best one to answer that question. We do have an accessibility policy. When we created the policy, we made it as simple and as straightforward as possible, but we also made it very forward thinking. So, we're not obligating anyone to go back and fix things. We're only asking that people move forward and think about anything new created or purchased or developed be accessible. And we have, a very rich website for the Electronic Accessibility Committee, what has a bunch of different resources on it about development. And we have a section specifically on purchasing that frankly does not get used enough. It is the policy at UC, and it is a legal obligation for us to purchase technologies that are accessible. And very few RFPs, except for ones run centrally by UCOP, actually include that language, and they should be, including the language, the questions, and the evaluation process that we've laid out for you.
Thank you so much. And I also just want to remind all of our audience members that we will be recording this panel. So a lot of the resources and links to policies, we'll be happy to share those afterwards. Andrea, any other questions in the chat box?
Well, there's not one in the chat box because I can't type it in the chat box. There's one that I would like to ask, actually. Are there any technologies, either on the accessibility or the security front, that make you excited from the other side of the house? So new technologies, the one that comes to my mind are password vaults, have been really nice for both security and accessibility.
That's actually a great one. There's still this weird legacy cybersecurity control that people put in where you can't cut and paste into the username or password fields on secure websites. But I agree, a password vault it's excellent.
I mean, we were provided a password vault for Berkeley about 3 years ago, just before the pandemic. And that password vault was not accessible to people with disabilities until I actually worked with them for the first year. And now I rely on it 100%. When it comes to technologies that I'm really excited about, it has nothing to do with accessibility, but it has a lot to do with security and, making sure that this technology works in the future and is not hackable is autonomy. Fully autonomous vehicles are something I'm very excited about, but I want those vehicles to be secure and safe.
I have a teeny tiny example. It's actually currently I'm seeing more often that when we type in our password, there's an there are more and more password screens that you can choose to look at your password when you type them. And that helps. It helps the cognitive segment of the population.
And this is Cecile jumping back in. I also just wanted to kind of, we have a couple more minutes left, but thinking of coming out of, we're still in the COVID-19 pandemic, but we saw so many sort of gaps around communication access, and people who were just learning how to use telehealth to have online medical appointments, or how to access critical information about COVID-19. What are some possible lessons learned from that experience? I'm thinking particularly of individuals who are deafblind. Making sure that in situations of emergencies and disasters, that people with disabilities have equitable access to the information and services they need. Would anybody like to answer that?
I think it's a really critical area that we haven't, as a society, done much work on, and it's got to be done. It's really frustrating for me to see some of those inaccessible technologies moving forward, even though they are inaccessible. I mean, telehealth, I was shocked during one of my telehealth meetings to note that the Zoom meeting was being live streamed. And I'm like, what? I'm meeting with a doctor and you're live streaming it somewhere? How on earth is that, is that secure? And how on earth is that medical appointment being, kept secure and confidential if you're live streaming? Well, it turned out it was going to the online system for the doctor's office for transcripting and for medical notes. But that wasn't being used as something that a person who is deaf or hard of hearing could use as transcript, because since they weren't using the in-meeting captioning, instead they were live streaming to a transcriber. The transcriber was transcribing the meeting, but the person, if they were deaf, could not get those captions. And that's, frightening at best. But the fact that it was being live streamed instead of kept within the confines of the secure HIPAA meeting bothers me.
Yeah, thank you for that detail, Lucy. So I know that Andrea has a few resources that you wanted to share with our audience members today. And before I share my screen with those resources, any final remarks, comments, insights from our panelists?
We did get one additional question in the chat, plus
Go
a
ahead.
comment as well.
Yeah,
So
go ahead.
someone commented that when Otter AI, which is a transcription tool, is used, it does say that Zoom is live streaming as well. So that can be seen for some accessibility. So if anyone can talk Otter AI into signing a BAA so they can be HIPAA compliant, please do. And so we had a question whether frames on websites are a problem. Qualtrics surveys and some videos are added to websites with frames, which may be a problem for screen readers.
About 10 years ago, yes. Currently today, no. However, when you're embedding that frame, the contents of the frame itself need to be tested. Qualtrics is one of my big buggy-boos, just so you know, because it is possible to make accessible surveys with it, but it is very difficult to do so, and you have to be very concise, and you have to know what you're doing, and you have to really follow some guidelines. And you have to get it tested. You can't just assume what you've done is right. I've seen some really good surveys come out, but the next and previous button are not labeled. So the frame is not a problem, but the contents of the frame should be considered closely.
Thank you. And I think we have one more. Yeah, Ting, did you want to share some final remarks and thoughts?
Oh, yes. Thank you, Cecile. Yes, just one final remark. I was just thinking about this, about your last question about the disaster information and including people when those crises happen. One of the big things that came about for me in working with blind and low vision students was that a lot of the information that comes out during crises is very graphics oriented. So just wanted to leave that, when there is information that is shared in only a graphical format, to really encourage designers and developers to think about how information can be conveyed in multimodal, multimedia formats, so that it's not just visual, or, you know, even if you're just tweeting a picture, to always have alt text with it. And with the way technologies are developing so quickly, that we can actually be much more creative in how to make information accessible for everybody, to have more fun with information, and that evolving, you know, development of data literacy.
Thank you so much for that excellent point. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to second what Ting said, because security is not just about testing the technical part of it. It's actually also communicating the information about how you sign on, you know, what to be careful of, and a lot of these communication medium are not accessible, and so the information is missed out.
Thank you so much, everyone, for such a rich and nuanced discussion on this topic. Thank you all for all your contributions. And now I'm going to quickly share a slide, and Andrea can take us through some of our resources.
So since this is a UC-wide webinar, I kept the resources at the UC level, but both of the accessibility and security resources include information about both, you know, about local contact at your own site, so who to talk to. So actually the link that says the UCOP electronic accessibility policy, that actually just points to the electronic accessibility webpage. I'll post the links in chat again so you can see them. The UC Tech Slack has both an accessibility and a security channel, and that's an excellent place for questions and further conversations. Great way to pull in experts. In fact, Glenda's got some questions about REDCap, and that might be a place to start with those. I don't think we'll have time to get to them now. And then, as was mentioned at the beginning, this is a Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and UC has a bunch of interesting webinars. This is actually the kickoff event, so thank you all for attending. And there'll be and paste the link in chat there are plenty more webinars hosted by the different sites, plus many of the sites are doing some in-person things as well. And then also, if you go to the next slide, the links will be, I guess I'll post the links in chat. There are also several articles that just give you, if you want to do some more in-depth reading, in particular, the CAPTCHA inaccessibility is a really thorough piece that goes into the different CAPTCHA technologies and what is and isn't accessible about them. So I'll post those links in chat. But anyway, thank you all for coming, and keep the conversation going. Like, that's what's important here, is that we're not in our own isolated silos. We can help each other make UC both a more secure and a more accessible place.
Yes, I second that, Andrea. That's great. This brings us to the end of our time today. I would like to extend my personal thanks to our panelists for sharing their expertise with us today, and to our wonderful moderator, Cecile Puretz. Thank you to all the attendees who joined us. We will be sharing a recording of today's webinar, and also we will be sending out a survey. So I hope to hear back from you of any way we can do better presentations in the future. And with that, everyone, have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
You as well.
Thank you.
Speech mode talk. Zoom webinar. Leave webinar button. Cancel button.